In the early 1990s, Los Angeles was a city caught between rebirth and decay. The scars of the 1992 riots were still fresh. Entire neighborhoods were struggling to rebuild, and the gap between hope and despair was wide enough for gangs to fill. In the shadow of downtown, the Westlake district, dense, impoverished, and teeming with new immigrants, became one of the most contested battlegrounds in the city's underworld. It was here, amid the smell of concrete and exhaust, that Juan "Termite" Romero carved out his name in blood and fear. Westlake was once a proud working-class community, but by the late 1980s it had become a pressure cooker of poverty, overcrowding, and violence. Apartment buildings designed for a few families now held dozens. The streets were lined with corner markets, pawn shops, and taquerias. But beneath the surface, another economy thrived: drugs. Crack cocaine and heroin poured through the area like floodwater, and the 18th Street Gang, already one of Los Angeles's most infamous criminal organizations, claimed the neighborhood as its own. The 18th Street Gang was unlike most others. Born in the 1960s, it started as a clique of Latino youths who had been rejected from other gangs. Over the decades, it expanded aggressively, recruiting immigrants from across Central America. By the 1990s, it had evolved into a sprawling criminal syndicate with thousands of members across California, Mexico, and Central America. Within this vast network were subgroups known as cliques, each running its own turf under the larger 18th Street banner. One of the most feared among them was the Lil Psychos clique, operating out of Westlake, and leading it was Juan "Termite" Romero. Romero wasn't the kind of leader who inherited power. He earned it. Born and raised in Los Angeles, he grew up surrounded by violence and instability. Friends from childhood would later recall that he seemed drawn to danger from a young age. He was street smart, quick-tempered, and fiercely loyal to those who showed him respect. By his late teens, he had already made a name for himself within 18th Street for his willingness to do what others wouldn't: intimidate, beat, or kill to protect the gang's interests. They called him Termite for the way he infiltrated neighborhoods, quietly spreading the gang's influence like decay through wood. As the leader of the Lil Psychos, Romero ran Westlake like a miniature kingdom. His soldiers patrolled the corners and alleys, collecting rent from street dealers who wanted permission to sell on his turf. Those who refused were swiftly dealt with, beaten, robbed, or disappeared. The money they made didn't just stay on the streets, it flowed upward. A percentage sent to Romero's imprisoned superior, a man known as Puppet Martinez, who oversaw operations from behind bars. In return, Puppet ensured Romero had protection and status within the broader 18th Street hierarchy. Through intimidation and organization, Romero turned Westlake into one of the gang's most profitable territories. Drugs, extortion, and violence became the daily rhythm of life. Residents lived in fear, knowing that crossing the wrong person, or even being seen talking to the police, could be fatal. Even business owners paid taxes to keep their stores safe. For law enforcement, Westlake was a nightmare maze of informants, lookouts, and street codes that silenced witnesses before cases could even be built. But beneath the power and the money, a dangerous tension simmered. The gang's expansion had brought it into conflict not just with rivals like MS-13 and the Playboys, but with its own members. The constant flow of drug money created greed, paranoia, and internal rivalries. Romero was ambitious, too ambitious for some. His growing independence and reputation began to draw suspicion from his superiors, especially Puppet Martinez, who controlled his clique from prison and feared that Termite might be growing too powerful. Still, Romero played the part of the loyal soldier. To the outside world, he was untouchable, dressed in crisp white shirts, gold chains, and driving cars that reflected his new wealth. But for the people of Westlake, he was a ghost that ruled the night. Stories spread of how he would show up at apartment buildings unannounced, warning tenants to mind their business if they wanted to stay safe. Others whispered about his temper, how even his closest associates risked their lives if they questioned his orders. Police officers who patrolled the area began to take notice. Detectives in the Rampart Division, then one of the LAPD's most corrupt and violent units, knew the name Termite well. They knew he was running drugs, that he was connected to Martinez, and that he had men willing to kill for him. But like many powerful street figures of that era, Romero was elusive. He rarely carried drugs himself, never made calls from his own phone, and often let others do his dirty work. To build a case against him was nearly impossible. As the 1990s progressed, Los Angeles's war on gangs intensified. The city poured millions into anti-gang task forces, community sweeps, and zero-tolerance crackdowns. But rather than weaken the gangs, it often made them stronger. The more members police arrested, the more the prison branches of gangs like the 18th Street grew. Behind bars, leaders like Puppet Martinez consolidated control, turning prison cells into command centers. Romero's loyalty to Martinez and his willingness to enforce the gang's orders on the street made him indispensable. Yet while the gang grew richer, the community around them burned. The violence was constant. Shootouts in alleys, drive-by killings, and innocent people caught in the crossfire. Mothers kept their children inside after sunset. Apartment buildings turned into drug dens. To outsiders, Westlake became a symbol of urban decay. But to Romero, it was the heart of his empire. There's a dark irony in Romero's rise. He saw himself as both protector and predator. To some in his clique, he was a leader who provided order in a world where chaos reigned. To others, he was a tyrant, a man who would burn everything he couldn't control. And it was that need for control, that hunger for dominance, that would soon lead to one of the most horrific crimes in Los Angeles history. By 1993, Romero's grip on Westlake was complete. He controlled who sold drugs, who collected money, and who lived or died on his turf. But with power came enemies, not just rival gangs, but ordinary people who were tired of living under his rule. One of them was the manager of a rundown apartment building in the neighborhood. The building had long been a hub for drug dealing, and the manager had begun cracking down, evicting known gang associates and trying to clean up the property. It was a small act of defiance, but in Romero's world, it was a challenge that couldn't go unanswered. What followed would ignite one of the darkest chapters in Los Angeles' history. A fire so brutal that it would haunt the city for decades, and a crime that would one day come back to destroy Juan Termite, Romero himself. The night of May 3rd, 1993, began like any other in the crowded heart of Westlake. The streets were alive with the hum of city sounds, cars crawling through traffic, the faint echo of music from open windows, and children laughing as they played in the narrow alleyways. But by dawn, the laughter would be replaced with screams, and the smell of smoke would linger over the neighborhood for weeks. At around 4 a.m., flames tore through a 3-story apartment building on Burlington Avenue, a few blocks west of downtown. The fire spread with terrifying speed, fueled by gasoline and old wooden structures that burned like paper. Within minutes, the blaze consumed the entire complex, trapping families in their sleep. By the time firefighters arrived, the building was an inferno, windows exploding, stairwells collapsing, and neighbors shouting helplessly from the street. When the flames were finally brought under control, the scene was beyond comprehension. 10 people were dead, 7 children and 3 women, 2 of them pregnant. The victims ranged from infants to young mothers who never made it out of their apartments. Some had tried to escape through windows, only to be overcome by smoke and heat. The building manager, who had lived on the ground floor, survived, barely, but would later describe hearing screams from the upper floors before everything went black. At first, the fire was believed to be an accident. Westlake's aging buildings were notorious fire hazards, many with faulty wiring and no proper fire escapes. But as investigators combed through the wreckage, the story began to change. Beneath the charred debris, arson specialists found traces of gasoline. The burn patterns were deliberate, controlled, and unmistakable. This was no accident. It was murder. Detectives soon uncovered whispers from the neighborhood. People spoke in low voices, afraid even to be overheard. The apartment manager had recently clashed with the 18th Street gang after trying to stop its members from selling drugs on the property. He had warned them, posted notices, even called the police a few times, something no one in Westlake did lightly. A few nights before the fire, a man had come to his door with a warning. "You don't tell us what to do here. This is our building." That man, according to later testimonies, was Juan Termite Romero. Witnesses placed Romero and 2 of his crew members near the building on the night of the fire, carrying what appeared to be gas cans. But in a neighborhood where fear ruled everything, no one dared to come forward officially. One woman who initially agreed to speak to police disappeared days later. Another witness recanted his statement after being threatened. The code of silence, enforced by 18th Street, was ironclad. Without direct witnesses, the case quickly went cold. Detectives knew Romero was behind it, but proving it in court was another matter entirely. Meanwhile, Romero walked the streets of Westlake as though nothing had happened. His power, if anything, grew. The fire served as a brutal message. Defy the gang, and you burn. Residents understood. The few who had spoken out against the gang vanished or fled the neighborhood entirely. To law enforcement, it was one of the most chilling examples of how deeply 18th Street's grip had sunk into Los Angeles. The gang wasn't just selling drugs, it was controlling communities through terror. The fire wasn't just an act of vengeance, it was a statement of dominance. For Romero, it solidified his reputation as someone who would stop at nothing to maintain control. But even as he basked in fear-driven power, cracks began to show in the foundation of his empire. The death toll from the fire brought unprecedented heat from the authorities. Federal agents joined the investigation, linking the arson to broader patterns of extortion, drug trafficking, and violence across the city. Detectives started tracing the chain of command that led from the streets of Westlake to the prison cells where leaders like Puppet Martinez issued orders. By 1995, the LAPD and federal prosecutors had developed a strategy to dismantle the 18th Street gang from the top down. They began targeting the gang's leadership with RICO charges, racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. They want the men behind the violence, not just the foot soldiers who carried it out. For years, Romero managed to evade major charges, protected by fear, silence, and the absence of direct evidence tying him to the fire. Still, the pressure was mounting. His name appeared in intelligence briefings, wiretaps, and debriefings of rival gang members. He was being watched, even if he didn't know it yet. Inside 18th Street, paranoia was also spreading. The imprisonment of senior members had created a power vacuum, and cliques began turning on each other. The once united organization fractured into smaller factions, each fighting for control. Romero's clique, the Lil Psychos, remained one of the strongest, but it was also one of the most volatile. Some of his lieutenants grew resentful, accusing him of keeping too much of the profits for himself. Others whispered that he had grown reckless, that the arson had brought too much attention. Behind bars, Puppet Martinez, still a powerful figure, began questioning Romero's loyalty. To maintain control, Romero doubled down on intimidation. He ordered hits on suspected rivals, expanded his control over drug corners, and even recruited younger members to act as enforcers. But the balance of power was shifting. As law enforcement intensified its operations, the gang's stronghold in Westlake began to weaken. Undercover agents infiltrated meetings, informants began cooperating, and slowly the myth of Romero's invincibility started to crack. Still, justice for the 1993 fire remained out of reach. Files gathered dust in evidence rooms. Families of the victims held candlelight vigils every year, pleading for answers, but no one was ever charged. Romero's name was mentioned often, but never in a courtroom. For him, it seemed as if the past had been buried along with the victims, and yet deep inside, the fire haunted him. Former associates would later recall how, in moments of drunken rage, Romero would reference that night in cryptic ways, boasting one minute, growing silent the next. He knew that what he had done couldn't stay hidden forever. But he also believed that fear and loyalty would protect him. For a time, they did. As the years passed, Romero's empire began to unravel from within. His mentor, Puppet Martinez, began to lose faith in him. Federal prosecutors were building large-scale cases that threatened to wipe out entire factions of the 18th Street Gang. And Romero himself, once the hunter, was now being hunted by both the law and his own people. In the end, the fire that had cemented his dominance would become the spark that ignited his downfall. But that reckoning was still years away. For now, Juan Termite Romero was still a king in Westlake, ruling over ashes, oblivious to the storm that was coming. By the late 1990s, the power that once made Juan Termite, Romero untouchable, had begun to corrode. The same fire that had terrified Westlake now cast a long, dark shadow over his life. The neighborhood was changing. New residents were moving in. Federal agents were watching closer. And even within the 18th Street Gang, loyalty was fading. For the first time, Romero wasn't the predator. He was becoming the prey. Inside California's prison system, the gang's hierarchy had grown more complex and dangerous. Leaders like, Puppet Martinez, Romero's old superior, continued to run operations through coded messages, smuggled phones, and corrupt intermediaries. Money flowed in from the streets, extortion, drug sales, weapons, but Puppet had started to notice discrepancies. Profits from Westlake weren't matching what Romero reported. Rumors began to spread that Termite was skimming off the top, keeping more than his fair share. For Puppet, that was a sin worse than betrayal. In gang politics, stealing from the organization wasn't just disobedience, it was treason. And in the world of the 18th Street Gang, treason was punishable by death. Romero sensed the shift. His calls to Martinez went unanswered. Messages sent through trusted intermediaries came back cold or distorted. He heard whispers that Puppet had authorized a green light, a gang order marking him for death. For the first time in his life, Romero found himself looking over his shoulder. His paranoia grew. He stopped driving his usual routes, avoided public places, and kept armed guards with him wherever he went. In the streets, the cracks widened. Some of his closest allies began to disappear. Others flipped sides, pledging loyalty to new leaders rising through the ranks. The once united Lil Psycho's clique was splitting apart, its younger members more loyal to money and survival than to Romero himself. Then came the assassination attempt that changed everything. One evening in 1999, Romero was leaving a small nightclub near MacArthur Park when a dark sedan pulled up beside his car. Gunfire erupted. Dozens of rounds tore through the night. Romero ducked for cover, glass shattering around him, bullets ripping through the driver's side door. Somehow, he survived, crawling away with a shoulder wound as the shooters sped off into the darkness. Police arrived minutes later, but witnesses refused to speak. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. Standard silence in Westlake. To outsiders, it was just another gang hit. To Romero, it was a message. His own people wanted him dead. After the shooting, Romero went underground. He changed safe houses, cut contact with most of his crew, and began questioning every face around him. The streets that had once bowed to him now felt like enemy territory. He had built an empire of fear, but now that fear was reflected back at him. The hunter had become the hunted. It was during this period of paranoia and isolation that federal investigators made their move. Agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force and the Drug Enforcement Administration had been building a case against 18th Street for years, using wiretaps, undercover buys, and informants. Their goal was simple: dismantle the gang's leadership through federal racketeering charges under the RICO Act. And Romero, once considered untouchable, was now a prime target. When agents finally cornered him during a routine traffic stop in early 2000, they didn't need to chase. Romero didn't fight. Maybe he knew the game was over. Maybe he was just tired. Either way, by the time he was in handcuffs, his empire was already gone. In custody, Romero faced a choice: stay loyal to the gang that had tried to kill him or save himself. It was a choice that would define the rest of his life. Federal prosecutors offered him a deal. If he cooperated, if he told them everything he knew about the 18th Street gang's structure, its leadership, its prison connections, they would protect him, possibly even reduce his sentence. At first, Romero laughed. Cooperation was death. In gang culture, there was nothing lower than a rat. But then came the realization. The gang had already marked him for execution. Puppet wanted him dead. The streets wanted him gone. The same organization he had killed for, bled for, and burned for had turned on him. So in one of the most shocking reversals in Los Angeles gang history, Juan Termite Romero flipped. At first, his cooperation was quiet, handled through confidential meetings in federal buildings under tight security. He provided names, structures, and details about operations that no outsider had ever been able to confirm. He mapped out how orders flowed from prison cells to street corners, how money was laundered through small businesses, and how gangs used coded messages to evade law enforcement. His testimony began to pull back the curtain on one of the city's most violent and secretive criminal networks. For prosecutors, Romero was a goldmine. For 18th Street, he was a ghost, a traitor whose name could not be spoken. Federal indictments rolled out across California, leading to dozens of arrests. Key figures in the gang were charged with racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. Some faced life sentences without parole. Law enforcement hailed it as a major victory in the war against organized crime. But for Romero, there was no victory. Every word he gave to the government was another nail in his coffin. Word spread quickly through the prison system that Termite had turned informant. The green light against him wasn't just still active, it was now permanent. As part of his deal, Romero was placed under federal witness protection. He was given a new identity, relocated out of California, and promised a chance to start over. On paper, he was no longer Juan Romero, the feared gang leader of Westlake. He was a new man with a new life. But inside, he carried the same memories, the same nightmares, the same guilt. For years, he vanished from public view. His name disappeared from headlines, his face from wanted lists. Somewhere, under a false name and a quiet existence, he tried to live like an ordinary citizen. But the ghosts of his past were never far behind. He knew that the 18th Street gang's reach was long, and that no one who betrays them ever truly escapes. And though he had traded the streets for safety, the fire he once set, the act that made him infamous, wasn't forgotten. The investigators who had chased him for years never closed the book on that case. Deep inside the LAPD archives, the files on the 1993 Westlake arson sat waiting, charred evidence, old photographs, and witness statements that no one had ever dared to use. They were waiting for the right moment, the right breakthrough, the right reason to reopen the wounds of the past. That moment would come decades later, when Juan Termite Romero, once a king of the streets and later a federal witness, would find his past catching up with him in the most unexpected and devastating way imaginable. When Juan Termite Romero entered the federal witness protection program, he disappeared as if erased from history. The man who once ruled the Westlake district, who commanded fear, loyalty, and death with a single word, was suddenly gone. No one on the street spoke his name anymore, except in whispers or curses. To the public, he was a ghost. To the government, he was an asset. A man who had traded blood for freedom. For the first few years, life under protection was a strange kind of purgatory. Romero had a new name, a new city, and a new story to tell anyone who asked. He was placed somewhere far from Los Angeles, likely in a quiet suburban or rural area where no one would think to look for a former gang leader. Federal handlers gave him a small stipend, helped him find work, and taught him how to blend in. He was warned never to contact anyone from his past, never to return to California, and never to speak of who he once was. But how do you bury a life like his? Romero tried to adapt, but he was haunted by the ghosts of Westlake, the victims of the fire, the faces of the children who never woke up, the screams that still echoed in his memory. He drank heavily. He avoided crowds. Some nights he would wake up in cold sweats, reliving the fire or the gunfights he had survived. To the outside world, he looked like just another middle-aged man trying to rebuild. But inside, he was still Termite, the man who once thrived on fear and control. Now, stripped of both, he was left with nothing but silence. The U.S. Marshals who managed his case knew that relocation rarely meant redemption. Many witnesses under protection struggled with the same torment: guilt, paranoia, and identity crises. Some returned to crime. Others broke the rules and reached out to old friends or family, desperate for a connection to their former lives. Romero was no different. Over the years, he quietly began to reconnect with fragments of his past. An old girlfriend here, a cousin there. Each time, he risked exposure. Each time, he told himself it would be the last. Meanwhile, back in Los Angeles, the 1993 Westlake arson never fully faded from memory. Detectives who had worked the original case eventually retired, but they passed their files down to younger investigators who refused to let it die. Advances in forensic technology had given them new tools. Burn patterns, accelerant traces, and chemical signatures could now reveal what the crude techniques of the 1990s couldn't. And with those advancements came a renewed interest in one name: Juan Romero. For decades, prosecutors had suspected his involvement, but lacked hard proof. The witnesses were gone or too afraid. But in the early 2020s, a cold case review unit, within the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office reopened the investigation. They revisited old evidence, ran fresh forensic tests, and followed a trail of sealed testimonies from Romero's own federal cooperation sessions. Buried within those files were fragments of statements, references to a fire, to a manager who wouldn't listen, and to a lesson that had to be taught. Those fragments were enough to reignite suspicion. By 2023, investigators had quietly begun coordinating with the U.S. Marshals Service. They wanted to know exactly where Juan Termite Romero was and whether the immunity granted to him for his cooperation covered crimes that had never been disclosed, particularly the 1993 arson. The Marshals hesitated. Romero was still under protection, and his cooperation had once helped dismantle one of the largest street gangs in U.S. history. But justice has a long memory, and the deaths of 10 innocent people could not be ignored.